Seeing none, let's move on to the next main speaker, Edmonton Strathcona.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm pleased that I may actually get a few moments to speak on this horrific piece of legislation before it is rammed through second reading as a result of the undemocratic decision of the government to bring in closure. So I want to begin by saying simply this. To those Albertans who have not yet figured out that the Premier of the province did nothing but line up promise after promise after promise after promise in the last election that she clearly had every intention to break, I hope now that all Albertans now get what they elected. They elected the Premier who has, you know, the Minister of Health accused us of being ideological when we talked about public funding today. And let me just say that there's an ideology on that side. And that ideology by that Premier is there is no promise she has ever met that she has not broken. And this is one of them. And this is, I have to say, probably the most profound betrayal to working people in Alberta since she's been elected. So this Premier has embarked upon, in her short career, she got elected the same time I did, actually, on quite an interesting attack on human rights, one that is really quite unprecedented in this province. First, she oversaw the introduction of Bill 44, the scarring of our human rights code that makes us have a human rights code in this province, which is an embarrassment to anybody who understands the concepts of human rights. And now she's bringing in Bill 45, which is the same kind of thing. It is an illegal law, Mr. Speaker. It is designed to bully working Albertans away from standing up against, wait for it, another illegal law. It's brought into force by a government that has lost its way, Mr. Speaker. Its moral compass, its connection to accountability for the record it ran on, and its connection to the real people of this province, Mr. Speaker. That's what this law is. Now, I've heard a lot of moral outrage and a lot of sense of self-justification over from that side about how we need to deal with the fact that people are engaging in illegal activity. So as I alluded to when I was asking questions of the member from Airdrie, the fact of the matter is this. When this government, and some people have done a lot of sort of celebration about when former Premier Lougheed eliminated the right to strike for the public service in Alberta, and let me just say that at that time my father was in this House and he fought tooth and nail against that piece of legislation because public servants should never have lost the right to strike in this province, Mr. Speaker, not ever. Now, ultimately, that decision of Premier Lougheed was taken to the Supreme Court of Canada, and the Supreme Court of Canada said, you know what? Here's what has to happen for this law to be legal. Workers need to maintain the right to join a union. They then need to maintain the right to bargain collectively for the terms and conditions of their employment. And finally, they need to maintain a mechanism for resolving the disputes around that bargaining if they cannot come to an agreement. Typically, in most democratic societies, that right looks like a right to strike, Mr. Speaker. In this province, it does not. It, unfortunately, looks like binding arbitration. Until last week, when this government introduced a plan to eliminate that as well. So, Mr. Speaker, based on that very age-old Supreme Court of Canada decision, one which in fact has been updated quite considerably in the court since then, anyone who knows anything about labour law, if they were betting people, they would bet that this government is introducing legislation that they know full well is going to be deemed illegal once the courts get their hands on it. Yet they continue, and they continue with their faux moral outrage about how they need to take action against workers who act illegally when they themselves sit over there and intentionally and knowingly introduce legislation that is in breach of the Constitution of this country. How dare they engage in such outrageous hypocrisy? How dare they talk about workers who are standing up for their safety and for their rights in the workplace as though they are somehow criminals who need to be beaten into submission at the same time that they are introducing a piece of legislation that they should know full well is itself illegal. I mean, just every day They amaze me, Mr. Speaker, with the level of their hypocrisy and their willing to break promises to the people of this province. So for those folks over there who are not really fully on top of the concept and the history of illegal strikes, let me just give you a little bit of background, because it's not all about a bunch of drunken vandals breaking windows at Starbucks like the folks in Vancouver after the last Stanley Cup final there. Strangely, that's not what it's all about. Here's some of the things that illegal strikes have done. They've ensured safety standards. They have ensured laws that people have the right to refuse unsafe work, that they don't have to go down into the coal mine that's about to explode. They actually get to refuse that. You know how they got to refuse that? By striking illegally, by standing up to guns that were directed at them by the government of the day, who, guess what, said, you guys are criminals, you're acting illegally. That's what illegal strikes did. They gave the right to refuse unsafe work. They gave a 6-day work week. Then they gave a 5-day work week. Illegal strikes gave us the minimum wage, Mr. Speaker. These are the things that illegal strikes have done, because you know what? Governments like this government have never been interested in bringing in laws that respect and honour the work of working people in this province or any other jurisdiction in this country. So Labour members have had to work for their rights. And that's their history. They've had to work for their rights. They've had to fight for their rights. So I am so deeply offended when a member over there tries to equate that history to a bunch of drunken vandals in Vancouver. That is outrageous, Mr. Speaker, and I would expect members from over there, when they bring in a piece of legislation like this, that is this heinous, that is this reflective of an attack on the history of the right to bargain in this country, that they should at least know their history, so they don't walk in and say things like that, because that is offensive and insulting to many, many, many working people in this province, and they should know better.
All of us. Disrespectful to all of us.
So, I will drop it down a notch now and try to speak a little bit more about some of the other elements of this bill which are so offensive to me, Mr. Speaker. We've talked a bit about the fines. Now, as things stand now, between the dues abatement, the liability fund, the fines for individual workers, the fines for representatives and union officials, it's safe to say that when someone goes on strike, or when a union goes on strike, they could easily, and it could be much bigger than this, but they could easily attract a fine of $2.5 million a day. And that fine would carry on for every day that the strike went on. Now, interestingly, folks, I just want to throw it out there. If through their negligence, whether intentional or not, an employer allows a workplace situation to continue such that a worker dies, you know what they can be fined? $500,000. And let's just be clear, it's not $500,000 for every day that that family has to deal with the fact that their loved one is dead.
Just one day.
Just one day. That death is over at the end of that day. But that strike, it's not over. We are going to continue fining them into the Stone Age, day after day after day. Does that sound like balance, Mr. Speaker? Does that sound like a government that understands or cares about balance in this province? Interestingly, I noted, as much as we are bringing in through Bill 45 the ability to fine unions $3 million or more a day for an illegal strike, the corresponding action, the illegal lockout, continues to be subject to, get this, a $10,000 maximum fine.
Oh.
So, you know, I will tell you, you could go to the Harvard School of Business. You could go to one of the most business-friendly schools of business, and they will tell you that effective labor relations relies on balance. Balance. And can I tell you, $10,000 versus $3 million a day? It's not so much with the balance, Mr. Speaker. We're kind of losing sight of the balance. We're so wrapped up in the desire to bully and punish and control and beat opposition in this province through fining them into the Stone Age, through pulling back their resources, through limiting their freedom of expression. They are so interested in that, they've completely forgotten that there's apparently no need to hold themselves to any kind of similar standard. So it just goes, I think, to outline the fact that is this. This government alleges that they are doing this in order to protect the public interest. Well, Mr. Speaker, this is not about the public interest. A month ago, we had a company dump 1 billion litres of poison into the Athabasca River. Just today, I went and I listened to a bunch of scientists talk about the incredible devastation that is bringing upon our environment, the generational destruction that is occurring to the habitat along the Athabasca River, the profound impact that this is going to have on our First Nations living all the way downstream. And yet, Mr. Speaker, no fine, no charges, nothing. And interestingly, the organization that would be responsible for that, the Alberta Energy Regulator, these guys actually went out of their way to bring in legislation that removed protection of the public interest from their mandate. So they're really concerned about protecting the public interest of Albertan when it comes to beating up on workers. But when it comes to protecting us, our air, our land, our water, from toxics and toxins being dumped into like the Athabasca River and permanently undermining the health of that important waterway, well, not only are they not going to levy any fines, but they're actually going to change the legislation so they're not held accountable for their failure to, wait for it, represent the public interest, Mr. Speaker. So these guys have no interest in representing the public interest, and every interest in representing their own interests. And that is profoundly clear through the way they have moved forward with this piece of legislation. You know, I just want to talk ever so briefly about the fact that we are going to be given such a limited opportunity to speak. Do you have the motions? No? Such limited opportunity to speak today in this legislature, Mr. Speaker. Can you find that freedom of speech now?
Yeah.
Thank you. That would be good. It is outrageous that we are not all going to get a chance to speak on this bill, because the amount of frustration you're hearing in my voice is shared by many people. And I want you to know, Mr. Speaker, that just the fact that it's in the standing orders does not make it right. Typically, the standing orders have to be read and used in the context of the overarching parliamentary precedent. And I just want you to know, Mr. Speaker, and I know this is no longer an issue because the acting speaker ruled against this, but you need to know this. Freedom of speech is both the least questioned and the most fundamental right of the members of Parliament on the floor of the House and in committee. It is the most fundamental right, and by bringing in closure after 2 speakers have spoken on a bill, this government may well be acting in accordance with the rules that they rammed down the throat of this Assembly, but they are not, by any means, acting in accordance with the historical and democratic tradition of this province or this country. There is no need for this, Mr. Speaker. Just in 6 months, this government brought in an extra $1 billion in revenue. There is absolutely no need for what they are doing here tonight. And the really sad thing of it is, Mr. Speaker, I think the reason we're here, I think the reason that all these workers are being victimized and our human rights are being undermined and our freedom of expression is being attacked is for the most cynical of reasons, Mr. Speaker. I think these guys want to pretend and make themselves look like the Wild Rose because they're kind of scared they're going to win the next election. I actually think that this horrible piece of legislation is a profoundly cynical political game that they're playing. And it's really unfortunate, Mr. Speaker, because they're doing it at the expense of some of the most deeply held, fundamental, important rights, which are the foundation of our civic, democratic society. They've raised cynicism to a brand new level, and all Albertans are paying the price, Mr. Speaker. Thank you.
Honourable member.